Hey everyone, this is a section from the chapter on permanent revolution. Uh, it's from uh, Baruch Knei-Paz's The Social and Political Thought of Leon Trotsky. The section's titled The Permanent Revolution, Stages, Process, Momentum. Let us now reconstruct Trotsky's actual scenario of the permanent revolution, bringing together, firstly, the various threads from which it is suspended. The scenario may be said to unfold against the following background. The particular correlation of forces in Russia at the beginning of the 20th century had driven the proletariat to the forefront of the opposition to the autocracy. In one sense, this was as logical as the revolutionary revolt of workers in advanced Western societies. Since in Russia, too, the workers were the product of an industrial and economic system made to function at their expense, and the fact that this system in Russia had different origins did not affect this reality. However, the persistence, concurrently, in Russia of a primitive economy and social system involved the existence of another class, the peasantry, whose problems could be solved only by revolutionary means, and made it impossible for the proletariat to pursue the solution of its problems in isolation from that class. The resultant alliance, growing out of mutual dependence, was tactical but not arbitrary. The resultant alliance was dictated, in effect predetermined, by the peculiarities of the socio-historical context. This did not mean that the alliance could be effectively concluded at any given moment. Various subjective factors might delay and undermine it, as had been the case in 1905. But in the long run, the clearer it became to both partners that neither could do without the other, it had to materialize. The initial task of such an alliance would be the overthrow of the existing political authority, but this was little enough. Once in power, it would immediately confront social issues. The resolution of these social issues would demand of the new regime that the new regime define the new regime's social character and philosophy. Thus, the future of an originally political alliance would be determined by the social policies which it would become necessary to pursue. And these, in turn, would determine the future of the revolution itself. This was the immediate social and political background. The scenario which Trotsky now unfolded may be said to consist of three acts, each flowing into another. Footnote. It should be stressed, however, that the end of each, quote, act in reality is less fixed than it would be were the, quote, scenario to be presented in, quote, theatrical form. The metaphor should not be equated with actual drama. End footnote. The first, quote, act may be entitled the, quote, emancipation of the peasant. This act would open with a new regime in power, its social composition heterogeneous, but its leading element clearly apparent. Although, quote, can and should include representatives of the peasantry, the urban petty bourgeoisie, the intellectuals, it is the representatives of the proletariat, quote, who will form within it a solid majority, end quote. Trotsky. Results and prospects. It cannot be otherwise, according to Trotsky. The bourgeois element, or rather a small minority of the bourgeois element, will have joined the revolution only after the fact, having played almost no role in it, and bringing with it neither economic nor social power. The peasants, without whom the revolution would indeed have been impossible, would nevertheless be subservient in view of the concentration of organizational power in the cities and not the countryside, a fact which in turn reflected the domination of town over country and industry over agriculture. The new government would thus be a coalition of diverse oppositional forces, but it is the proletariat whose participation would be, quote, dominating and leading, end quote. One may, of course, describe such a government as the dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry, a dictatorship of the proletariat, peasantry, and intelligentsia, or even a coalition government of the working class and the petty bourgeoisie. But the question nevertheless remains, who is to wield the hegemony in the government itself, and through it in the country? From what we have said, it will be clear how we regard the idea of a, quote, proletarian and peasant dictatorship, end quote. It is not really a matter of whether we regard it as admissible in principle, whether, quote, we do or do not desire, end quote, such a form of political cooperation. We simply think that it is unrealizable, at least in a direct, immediate sense. Indeed, such a coalition presupposes either that one of the existing bourgeois parties commands influence over the peasantry, or that the peasantry will have created a powerful independent party of the peasantry's own. But we have attempted to show that neither the one nor the other is possible, end quote. Trotsky. Results and prospects. Footnote. Although Trotsky did not mention Lenin, it is obvious to Trotsky that these words were addressed in the first instance. End footnote. Nevertheless, the dominance of the proletarian over the peasant and bourgeois representatives would not reflect, at this stage, the order of social priorities which the new government would set itself and pursue. On the contrary, although its initial steps would be as essential to it as its collaborators, they would put into effect policies whose aim was to serve and satisfy the interests primarily of the non-proletarian elements, peasant as well as bourgeois. Here Trotsky had in mind not only those first measures whose objectives were, as Trotsky put it, quote, cleansing the Augean stables of the old regime and driving out its inmates, end quote, which would, quote, meet with the active support of the whole nation, end quote. Trotsky. Results and prospects. Beyond this elementary task, the government, at the instigation of the proletariat, would seek to institute democratic rights and to alleviate, as far as was feasible immediately, the predicament of the peasants. Quote, the dominance of the proletariat will mean not only democratic equality, free self-government, the transference of the whole burden of taxation to the rich classes, the dissolution of the standing army and the armed people, and the abolition of compulsory church imposts, but also recognition of all revolutionary changes, expropriations and land relationships carried out by the peasants. The proletariat will make these changes the starting point for further state measures in agriculture, end quote. Trotsky. Results and prospects. Thus the spontaneous, quote, grabbing of land by peasants in the wake of the revolutionary fervor would receive the official sanction of the new government and would presumably be even encouraged by the new government. Its immediate social effect would be the expropriation of the landed nobility, the, quote, abolition of feudalism, end quote. It was in this sense, Trotsky declared emphatically, that, quote, the proletariat in power will stand before the peasants as the class which has emancipated it, end quote. Trotsky. Results and prospects. Quote, under such conditions, the Russian peasantry in the first and most difficult period of the revolution will be interested in the maintenance of a proletarian regime, quote, workers' democracy, end quote. At all events, not less than was the French peasantry in the maintenance of the military regime of Napoleon Bonaparte, which guaranteed to the new property owners, by force of its bayonets, the inviolability of its holdings. And this means that the representative body of the nation, convened under the leadership of the proletariat, which has secured the support of the peasantry, will be nothing else than a democratic dress for the rule of the proletariat, end quote. Trotsky. Results and prospects. But if this agrarian policy was the, quote, starting point, what, quote, further state measures could the government take? Here, following Trotsky, we arrive at a crucial point. The stage at which the first, quote, act fades into the second, almost imperceptibly at first, but ever more sharply, without, in a sense, the actors themselves being aware of the change of scenery. It is here, in effect, that Trotsky claimed to identify the first emergence within the revolution of the revolution's, quote, permanent character. For while the movement was from one stage to another, the stages became apparent only at the peripheries of a process, and the whole was driven forward by the internal momentum of the revolutionary mechanism. The, quote, separateness of the stages was a schematic abstraction, to be made, perhaps, when the history of the revolution came to be recorded. The revolution itself, the living reality of the revolution, was an uninterrupted process, a spectrum whose colors shaded off into one another progressively. If the first act was sudden, immediate and short-lived, the second was one of transition. It slid into view as a result, initially of the agricultural question, and came into full focus at the moment that the government, almost concurrently, turned to industrial issues. The expropriation of privately owned estates does not itself solve the agrarian problem. For a part of the peasantry, at least, it may even aggravate it, since the effective result of unplanned, spontaneous, and therefore arbitrary distribution of land would be to favor some peasants at the expense of other peasants. To break up large estates and parcel those estates out to small producers would be no solution, since it would perpetuate primitive and inefficient methods of agricultural production. Furthermore, the immediate nationalization and, quote, equalization of the use of land, end quote, would be not only economically wasteful and even ruinous, but politically suicidal. It would arouse the immediate opposition of the mass of the peasantry, for whom the emancipation meant private land, not state or public holdings. It would mean alienating the peasantry even before the regime had had time to establish the regime's self. Trotsky would clearly prefer to avoid or delay an extremist policy one way or another. Far more desirable was a piecemeal, pragmatic approach which would avoid precipitating a clash of interest within the government, the effect of which would only lead to a weakening of the proletariat's support in the countryside. Yet the relationship with the peasantry, even under conditions of general appeasement, would remain problematical. On the one hand, there would be the tension growing out of the general social incompatibility between the two classes. On the other, appeasement could not go so far as to permit the formation of a set pattern of agricultural relations and production which were in opposition to the long-term interest of the workers. Quote, though the absence of accumulated bourgeois individualistic traditions and anti-proletarian prejudices among the peasantry and the intellectuals will assist the proletariat to come into power, it is necessary, on the other hand, to bear in mind that this absence of prejudices is due not to political consciousness but to political barbarism, social formlessness, primitiveness, and lack of character, end quote. Trotsky, Results and Prospects. This bitter reality was not a reliable basis for the stable sharing of power, and it would assert itself the moment that the proletariat attempted to carry out its minimal obligations towards that part of the peasantry with which the proletariat's ties were closest, the agricultural proletariat. Quote, the abolition of feudalism will meet with support from the entire peasantry as the burden-bearing estate. A progressive income tax will also be supported by the great majority of the peasantry. But any legislation carried through for the purpose of protecting the agricultural proletariat will not only receive the active sympathy of the majority, but will even meet with the active opposition of a minority of the peasantry. End quote. Trotsky, Results and Prospects. Yet such legislation could not be avoided by the workers. Moreover, it was the best possible condition under which to prepare for the confrontation with the peasantry. It would not arouse the great mass of peasants, as other extreme measures might, and it would both split the peasantry and turn parts of the peasantry against the countryside as allies of the workers. The inevitable clash thus did not erupt suddenly and immediately, but gradually, and followed a tactical path aimed at both a minimum resistance and the accumulation of support. Quote, the proletariat will find itself compelled to carry the class struggle into the villages, and in this manner destroy that community of interest which is undoubtedly to be found among all peasants, although within comparatively narrow limits. From the very first moment after its taking power, the proletariat will have to find support in the antagonism between the village poor and the village rich, between the agricultural proletariat and the agricultural bourgeoisie. End quote. Trotsky. Results and prospects. Though for politically tactical reasons the conflict with the peasantry should be confined to these limits for as long as possible and not aggravated by an immediate extremist solution of the agrarian question, the further degeneration of relations between workers and peasants was inevitable, Trotsky believed. The fault lay not so much in post-revolutionary phenomena as in the forced nature of the original alliance, since it was created for the purposes of the uprising itself. Its possibilities would be exhausted with the overthrow of the autocracy and the introduction of basic democratic forms. Beyond these immediate objectives there was not, and could not be, agreement. Thus the clash which would now come would be only a reflection of the original and fundamental lack of consent on social issues. The parting of the ways would mark the disintegration of the national coalition and the coming to the fore of purely class interests. Quote, every passing day will deepen the policy of the proletariat in power and more define the proletariat's class character. Side by side with that, the revolutionary ties between the proletariat and the nation will be broken, the class disintegration of the peasantry will assume political form, and the antagonism between the component sections will grow in proportion as the policy of the workers' government defines itself, ceasing to be a general democratic and becoming a class policy. End quote. Trotsky, Results and Prospects. The severity of this process was not confined to problems of agriculture, however. It might begin there, but in the meantime it would have extended to problems of industry, that is, to those problems which directly affected the interest of the workers themselves. Here, too, the most moderate reforms, the most elementary fulfillment of workers' demands, would lead to a sharpening of the class struggle, at first on a different front, and to the eventual isolation of the proletariat from the nation. The reaction of the quote, capitalists to such basic demands for reform would be out of all proportion to the substance and scope of these demands. Trotsky gave two examples of this: the demand for an 8-hour day and the demand for an alleviation of the problem of unemployment. In themselves, Trotsky noted, these were not radical demands. In fact, in the case of the 8-hour day, it, quote, by no means contradicted capitalist relations, end quote. Trotsky, Results and Prospects. But the introduction of the 8-hour day in the immediate wake of a revolution within which the proletariat occupied the dominant position would arouse suspicion and would be interpreted as a direct challenge to property interest. The introduction of the 8-hour day would be seen as only the first of a long line of demands, the ultimate aim of which was to undermine private property, and which had therefore to be resisted at the very outset. So the 8-hour day itself would lead to panic-riddled countermeasures, to, quote, organize and determine resistance, end quote, by owners of industrial concerns, which would take the form of lockouts or the closing down of factories. Quote, hundreds of thousands of workers would find themselves thrown onto the streets. What should the government do? ... under the political domination of the proletariat, bracket, in contrast to one dominated by the bourgeoisie, end bracket. The introduction of an 8-hour day should lead to altogether different consequences. For a government that wants to rely upon the proletariat and not on capital, as liberalism does, ... there would be only one way out: expropriation of the closed factories and the organization of production in the closed factories on a socialized basis, end quote. Trotsky, Results and Prospects. A similar course of events would follow, in Trotsky's view, in the case of the attempt at dealing with the problem of unemployment. The attempt itself could not be avoided, since the workers' representatives could hardly reject their constituents' demands in this sphere by replying with, quote, arguments about the bourgeois character of the revolution, end quote. Trotsky, Results and Prospects. Suppose then that the government committed the government self to maintaining the unemployed in whatever form. This would be a threat to the existence of a, quote, reserve army of labor, end quote, upon which industrial owners relied. It would constitute a, quote, shift in economic power to the benefit of the workers, and it would be completely unacceptable to the industrialists. Quote, there is nothing left for the capitalists to do, then, but to resort to the lockout, that is, to close the factories. It is quite clear that the employers can stand the closing down of production much longer than the workers, and therefore there is only one reply that a workers' government can give to a general lockout: the expropriation of the factories and the introduction in at least the largest of them of state or communal production. End quote. Trotsky. Results and prospects. Thus, the proletariat does not begin with radical measures, but it is forced into radical measures, driven not so much by the proletariat's own will as the momentum of the revolutionary process unfolding in concrete day-to-day questions. Somewhere during this process, the dividing line between the first and second act is transversed until the revolution becomes quite clearly identifiable as completely different in character from what it had been at its outset. Minimal demands become converted into maximal demands. Elementary claims are transformed by a process of radicalization. This prompted Trotsky to note how absurd was the notion that a workers' government, even during a workers' government's first days in power, could make a distinction between the workers' government's, quote, minimum and maximum, end quote, programs, between the workers' government's short-term aims and the workers' government's long-term aims. The two were inextricably mingled from the outset by the very fact that the workers would be in actual power and not simply a pressure group standing outside government. It is not the, quote, original intention of the proletariat's representatives, but their role in the government, not as, quote, powerless hostages, but as the, quote, leading force, which would destroy the borderline between minimum and maximum programs, both, quote, in principle and in immediate practice, end quote. Trotsky, Results and Prospects. In effect, Trotsky suggested, the actual scope of the workers' program could not be predicted in advance, since the actual scope of the workers' program was a function of the revolutionary process itself, of the possibilities the revolutionary process might open up, and not of a carefully worked out plan. This did not mean, however, that the process or transition from the first to the second stage or act could itself be aborted. This much, Trotsky believed, was guaranteed by the existence of a workers' government. This, after all, was the unique feature of a revolution in Russia, namely that it would immediately catapult the proletariat into the dominant position of actual rule. The fact that this would happen in a country which had not had a bourgeois revolution or government did not mean that therefore a different class would carry out a bourgeois revolution. The, quote, substitution, end quote, of one class by another was not merely a technical detail, a change in instruments. It was a change in the whole character of the revolution, in its entire social content. Thus the idea that in Russia the only detour from past revolutionary models would be that the proletariat would make the bourgeois revolution and thereby rest content was an idea divorced from the logic of social conditions and class behavior. Quote, a proletarian government under no circumstances can confine itself, end quote, to a bourgeois revolution. Quote, to imagine that it is the business of social democrats to enter a provisional government and lead that provisional government during the period of revolutionary democratic reforms, fighting for revolutionary democratic reforms to have a most radical character, and relying for this purpose upon the organized proletariat, and then, after the democratic program has been carried out, to leave the edifice they have constructed so as to make way for the bourgeois parties and themselves go into opposition, thus opening up a period of parliamentary politics, is to imagine the thing in a way that would compromise the very idea of a workers' government. This is not because it is inadmissible, quote, in principle. Putting the question in this abstract form is devoid of meaning, but because it is absolutely unreal. It is utopianism of the worst sort, a sort of revolutionary Philistine utopianism, end quote. Trotsky, results and prospects. The fact is, Trotsky argued, that a revolution led by the proletariat could not be defined as a bourgeois revolution, though amongst its initial aims were certain bourgeois institutional forms. Such forms, however, were themselves transitory and could exist only so long as they provided a basis for further development. They were never entirely completed, for before that could happen, social policies were instituted by the workers' government which made different institutional forms necessary. In this way, the revolution passed from the tasks arising out of the country's backwardness, its failure in the past to make bourgeois democratic changes, to tasks aspiring out of its advanced structures, its success in adopting a modern industry. Since it was the workers, the product of the latter, who stood at the head of the revolution, it was the modern tasks which eventually had to become paramount. Thus, in effect, a bourgeois revolution in the 20th century was impossible. In the, quote, given world historical conditions, the revolution at the beginning of the 20th century, discovers before it the prospect, of breaking through the barriers, of the bourgeois revolution, end quote. Trotsky, results and prospects. The idea that Trotsky was therefore proposing was the quote, idea of uninterrupted revolution. The idea of uninterrupted revolution, an idea that connects the liquidation of absolutism and feudalism with a socialist revolution, end quote. I'm going to repeat that because that kind of seems like it sums it up. The idea that Trotsky was therefore proposing was the quote, idea of uninterrupted revolution, an idea that connects the liquidation of absolutism and feudalism with a socialist revolution, end quote. Trotsky, results and prospects. Footnote. This is the only place in Results and Prospects where the phrase, quote, uninterrupted revolution, end quote, actually appears. The phrase permanent revolution does not appear at all, but in later years Trotsky accepted this latter as the identifying name for Trotsky's theory of the Russian Revolution. End footnote. However, Trotsky warned, it would be no less utopian to believe that the transition to this stage of the revolution guaranteed the actual triumph of socialism. The socialist transformation itself still lay in a relatively distant future and was far from being a certainty. The most that could be said for this stage was that it would have irreversibly broken with its bourgeois beginnings and begun to lay the foundations of a socialized society. It would have placed, quote, collectivism on the order of the day, end quote, as its distinguishing feature, not as a completed task, but as a policy to be pursued. It would have begun instituting the principle of collectivism in industry and in agriculture, but in a limited manner, and only in the most receptive sectors of the economy. It would be greatly constrained by the strength of the opposition it would encounter and by the objective technical difficulties of organizing production in a country such as Russia. The opposition would come both from the, quote, capitalists and the peasants. The former, however, the capitalists, could be relatively easily dealt with. It was the peasants who would have the potential power of breaking the back of the workers, of arresting the further extension of socialist politics. The more class-oriented, that is, collectivist, the policies of the workers became, the more adamant would be the opposition of the peasantry, until finally it would, quote, turn its hostile face toward the proletariat, end quote. Quote, the primitiveness and petty bourgeois character of the peasantry, the peasantry's limited rural outlook, the peasantry's isolation from world political ties and allegiances, will create terrible difficulties for the consolidation of the revolutionary policy of the proletariat in power, ... The more definite and determined the policy of the proletariat in power becomes, the narrower and more shaky does the ground beneath its feet become. All this is extremely probable and even inevitable. End quote. Trotsky. Results and prospects. The resulting political problems of, quote, continuing the revolution single-handed would, however, be further aggravated by social and economic difficulties, and nothing would be more difficult than the actual organization of, quote, social production. The fundamental poverty of the country, the lack of experience in planning and self-management, the problem of coordinating agricultural and industrial production, the shortage of technique and know-how, all these would undermine the new government's capacity to go beyond the most elementary stages of collectivism. A, quote, number of oases, end quote, would be created, but, on the whole, nothing which even approached a socialist society. Quote, it would be absurd to suppose that it is only necessary for the proletariat to take power and then by passing a few decrees to substitute socialism for capitalism. An economic system is not the product of actions of the government, ... bracket, and bracket, a government of the proletariat is not a government that can perform miracles, end quote. Trotsky. Results and prospects. Trotsky was here quoting from an article Trotsky had written in November 1905 for the newspaper Nachalo. It may also be found in Nasha Revoluция. End footnote. In effect, therefore, the second stage or, quote, act of the revolution would have here exhausted itself, though its bourgeois beginnings would have been transcended, though the groundwork for socialist policies would have been prepared. The further development of the revolution through internal forces would have become impossible. This is the point at which the full indigenous potential of the Russian proletariat, in fact of Russian society, would have reached its limits. It would now, moreover, be threatened by virtual collapse, having aroused the opposition of the peasant masses. Politically, therefore, it would stand isolated, vulnerable, in danger of being liquidated by a counter-revolution. If the workers had come to power because of the particular advantages offered by Russia's backwardness, it was the disadvantages of that backwardness which would now make their position unmaintainable. Their prospects of sustaining themselves and their policies would no longer be dependent on them, but on developments which were for the most part beyond their control. Everything, in fact, would now depend not on what happened inside Russia, but outside. The permanent revolution, begun within national boundaries, had now to spill over into the international arena. That's the end of this section. Thank you so much for listening.